Yesterday, May 25th, 2026, was Memorial Day in the United States. We celebrated and commemorated the sacrifices made by some very fine people on behalf of this nation. What Abraham Lincoln called the last full measure of devotion in his Gettysburg Address. And I want to talk about a couple of recent examples because they provide optimism for the kinds of people that this country produces, and that gives me positivity. I'm Dr. Max Nervlansky. Welcome to Biocomputation with Max. So let's dive right into it. It's patriotic to ask about objectives of sacrifices that I'm about to describe. But first, let me set the stage. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of offices for veterans of foreign affairs and chapters all over the country. This reflects a couple of things. The American population has broadly participated in wars, which have been fought on foreign soil for some 200 years. That's the second point. Japan did occupy two frozen islands, Attu and Kiska, for several months during World War II, but I challenge you to find them on the map. The last proper invasion of the United States was the War of 1812. So consider it. Now we're about to celebrate 250th anniversary, and majority of that time, our nation has been fighting everything from the Revolutionary War, the British in the War of 1812, and then Manifest Destiny, Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, and many minor conflicts in between. While China, of course, is interested in pointing out examples of US aggression, and they have posted articles on this in Global Times, like the one I'm referencing. This does not invalidate that claim, especially when many US-based studies concur with this. For example, consider John Mearsheimer and the Quincy Institute, of which he's a part, posted an article about why US military interventions have increased after Cold War. One of his former students, together with another great researcher, has co-written a related book called The Military Intervention Project, the new data set of US military interventions from 1776 to 2019. Both of them have observed that there are hundreds of military interventions since the revolution. That number, depending on how you count, is 400 to 500. And there's been a rapid acceleration since the end of Cold War. In fact, roughly a quarter of all of our military engagements have occurred since then. So let me talk about the first hero, Pat Tillman. Of course, he was an accomplished athlete, and his sacrifice is well known. The other person I want to mention in this context is Muhammed Ali. His sacrifices were not acknowledged at the time, but were recognized more and more during his later years. And of course, after his passing, there's been a reevaluation of his approach to patriotism. So let me go into those two examples. Of course, Pat Tillman's sacrifice is quite clear. He was a starring player in college, and despite being undersized for a football player, he was named Defensive Player of the Year in 1997 and helped to lead his team to an undefeated regular season. He was drafted by NFL Arizona Cardinals in the 7th round in 1998. He turned down a renewed NFL contract and volunteered for elite U.S. Army Rangers after 9/11, and enlisted in 2002, serving several combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, where tragically he was killed at the age of 27 in 2004. Even more tragically, perhaps, this was a friendly fire incident, which the Army hushed up for a while. And this was because Pat was a very creative individual, in fact, a leader. He was thinking outside of the box. In the typical clash in Afghanistan, a convoy going through some road would be ambushed from high ground by the Taliban or their allies, and the convoy, like some armored train, would shoot its way out. Pat did something that infantry is supposed to do, show initiative, and he flanked the enemy. He climbed the mountain and engaged the fighters there. Unfortunately, uh, most of his colleagues were not so proactive and were not expecting to see an American at those heights at the top of the peak, and they used 50 cal heavy machine guns to blast the area, and Pat was mortally wounded in that incident. He was quite a tragic loss. He was a great individual according to family and school friends. He was repeatedly mentioned in he repeatedly mentioned in his personal journals during wartime service that he drew his strength from his connections to people near him, his friends, his parents, his wife. So Tillman, of course, part of his tragedy in the sense is that his sacrifice was shared by his family. He married his high school sweetheart, and shortly after that marriage enlisted in the army. He was also very close to his brother Kevin, who enlisted alongside him. So the sacrifice is not just made by him, but by his whole family and friends who knew and benefited from him while he was alive. And of course, we can question that sacrifice given the nature of how United States military under President Biden has pulled out in Afghanistan, very abruptly abandoning some 90 billion in military hardware and surrendering many of the gains to the Taliban. Now, let me turn to Muhammad Ali. He showed a different kind of bravery. He outright refused to enlist in the Vietnam War. He stared down the media, saying essentially that Vietnamese are not my enemy, you are. And of course, he was referring to the racist nature of the society from which he was coming. And he said, when you deny me my rights at home, why should I fight abroad? And that was a very courageous stance because of the political machine that was as strong at that time, especially in the late 60s, before the essential fiasco of that conflict was manifest. But at that time, of course, not only the politicians were all aligned, but the media was lambasting him, and they were only happy to see him suffer a loss of money, his title, and risk 5 years in prison. As I mentioned before, Pat Tillman, obviously, he made a different kind of sacrifice, but Muhammad Ali sacrificed 4 years of his career and was prevented from boxing competitively. He fortunately did not serve any prison time. He was convicted in 67, but this was in the courts until it was overturned in 71. So for 4 years, he was in jeopardy of being thrown in prison. And of course, he lost those prime years of his career. And only several years later, after he came back and won back his title and much acclaim, he only shortly thereafter he began to suffer from Parkinson's disease. So that, I think, colors the cost of the opportunity cost of him refusing the draft. What's also, I think, notable is that Martin Luther King Jr., who was quite a pacifist as opposed to Malcolm X or much more pugilistic Ali, MLK supported Ali's stance on the draft. MLK opposed both Vietnam War and the draft. Of course, we can contrast this with some of our current leaders who seem to be happy to embrace conflict, whether it's continued conflict in Ukraine or Iran, or possibly new fronts being opened up in Cuba or elsewhere. And of course, I'm talking about our current president, Donald J. Trump, who received 5 military deferments during the Vietnam War. The first four were educational deferments while he was in college. The last one was for bone spurs in his heels. And that's something that bears a little bit of valuation. He was a 22-year-old athlete at 6 feet 2 inches tall who suddenly developed bone spurs. Donald Trump attended New York Military Academy at Cornwall-on-Hudson from 1959 to 1964, nearly 5 years. That was at insistence of his father, who sent him there at the age of 13 because Donald was acting up and was displaying behavioral problems. During his 5 years at that military boarding school, Trump channeled his energy into sports and also rose to the rank of cadet captain. At the academy, he was a dedicated and talented athlete by many accounts. He played soccer, football, and was captain of the baseball team. He went on to play college sports, which is something that requires a fair degree of athleticism. So at Fordham University, which he attended from 65 to 66, he was a member of squash and tennis teams. And then he transferred to University of Pennsylvania, where admittedly he did not play any sports for 2 years. And then he received his medical deferment for Vietnam War in 1968. As he said later, over a period of time, it healed up, referring to the bone spurs. Of course, it's possible that a repeated sports kind of injury and the stress has produced these bone spurs. But there were perhaps other opportunities to serve, and perhaps Navy or Air Force. Back in the day, for example, JFK was sent by his father to serve in the military after his older brother perished on a very critical mission during World War II. So this is the tradition that has existed in the past. The leaders of a country would be also leading the military charge, quite literally. But that is apparently not the case, and that disparity between their willingness to send other men to military engagements and risk themselves and their own children is certainly very worrying and needs to be addressed, so that the decisions that are made on behalf of a country to risk young men and women in these excursions, as Trump called the Iran conflict, are justified. I bring up DJT because, to put it mildly, he is very enthusiastic about military engagements abroad. Of course, he led us into two engagements, hot engagements with Iran, and hopefully that's going to cease, but perhaps that's going to pave the way for him to open a new front in Cuba, and he is seemingly bent on bringing some kind of glory and basically pillage back to the country, perhaps based on his semi-success in Venezuela, which of course is now sending its oil to the United States and not to Cuba. So coming back to Muhammad Ali, he famously tried to say that I am America, and maintained even during that time that he was a patriot. He said, I am a part of America you don't recognize, but get used to me. And I think that's an important element. Just like MLK, who was also part of America and made the ultimate sacrifice, Muhammad represents an important segment of the society, of African American society and experience in particular, but of society more broadly. And it's appropriate that over time, although he was rejected, especially by the white America in the 60s, he was later embraced as essentially an American hero, lighting the Olympic torch in 1966 and becoming a beloved humanitarian. He represented the United States on numerous global diplomatic and humanitarian missions. In 2005, while already racked by Parkinson's, he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor in the United States, cementing his status as a celebrated American icon during his life. So to recap, these are two outstanding American men who paid a high price for US foreign wars. Their origins and motivation are as different as the color of their skin, but they both represent something great about America. So yesterday, as we celebrated the Memorial Day, I wanted to think about our heroes. Today, past Memorial Day, I can mention some of the other individuals who do not fall into that category, like, unfortunately, our presidents who have been way too eager to send men, whether ours or Ukrainians or Syrians, to continued conflicts, to forever wars. In fact, President Trump has even said that the bombing of Iran had occurred out of habit. So during its nearly 250 years, the United States has produced many inspiring patriots, and it's important to remember and to honor their sacrifices. I think it's good to reflect on the conflict on Vietnam and how it has turned out. Specifically, it has been a major contributor to Nixon taking USA off the gold standard in 1971 because the United States economy was undermined by massive expenditures on that foreign conflict. Vietnam is now the seventh largest trading partner of the United States behind Germany and Japan, despite being a socialist republic and its largest city being named after Ho Chi Minh, the famous opponent of the United States during that war. So that certainly brings up questions of the sacrifice of the men and women who have died for that conflict, millions of Vietnamese and tens of thousands of Americans. And it seems to me that Muhammad Ali's bravery was certainly something we need to celebrate, just as we celebrate patriots like Pat Tillman, who have given their final full measure of devotion to the United States. So let us resolve to hold our leaders accountable for the sacrifices they request of our fine men and women in the military.